Okay, so I'm Maarten van Helden. I'm working at SARDI here in Adelaide, and my main research issue is Russian wheat aphid. Well, we've been looking really into the Russian wheat aphid in different regions to see how big the threat is and how much damage it actually does. It's an aphid that gives people a lot of fear because it causes very strong symptoms, and the question is, how do these symptoms eventually translate into damage? Of course, we've had Russian wheat aphids in this country only for the last 2 years. So it's very difficult to get a good, reliable estimate of each region, especially because some regions that last year didn't have any Russian wheat aphids got infested this year. Eyre Peninsula is a beautiful case. They were not expecting it, and they got pretty heavy infestations this year. And even in areas where last year there were already aphids, or 2 years ago, last year, we saw bigger populations than we had before. So that's difficult to know how that's going to establish we think that it is more of an issue in the lower rainfall areas. That's what's coming out of our limited observations and limited experience. Well, many farmers are already managing it. Many farmers are using seed treatments. Seed treatments are extremely efficient. We'll eliminate the aphids in early season, and if you can eliminate that, then there's little risk of getting problems later. The question is also, do you always need to use those seed treatments? Because it seems to us so far that in some regions there's very little actual numbers of Russian wheat aphids. They are present, but not in numbers sufficient to give damage on the crop. Obvious, what's very clear everywhere is that the green bridge, so the presence of volunteer cereals and grasses, but mainly cereals in the paddock just before sowing, needs to be avoided. So it's very important that that's being eliminated by either spraying it out or grazing or even cultivating. If you can avoid that, you already have done quite a good job. That basically reduces the initial infestation quite strongly, and then the infestation that is still coming, because it will come, will be coming from either roadsides or areas where these grasses are growing, or maybe from a neighboring paddock where there is some volunteer cereals. That's difficult to control if it's not your paddock, of course. The main invasion, I would say, of crops arrives in the very early growth stages. So what we've seen is that in very early sowing, April up to May, when it's still relatively warm, then you get early infestation of the crop. They're usually very visible because you can see the clear symptoms, the striping on the leaves, the rolling of the leaves. If you have seen that a couple of times, you can easily spot it in a paddock. And that is a good indication of the presence of aphids. But to be honest, I can find them in almost every paddock if I want to, if I put in enough effort. The question is then, how high is that risk of building up and continuing? Because the real damage is only done in spring. If the aphid continues to build up in spring on the plants when they are heading flowering, and what we've seen so far in many of our trials is that that actually doesn't happen. So weirdly enough, the aphids arrive in autumn, will maintain themselves in winter at low populations, slowly building up, and then in spring, when the plants start to go into heading, for some reason the aphids leave. It seems as if our Australian varieties seem to almost outgrow the aphid populations. And then in the end, the flag leaves on the wheats come out, nice and healthy, and they can still produce yield as if there has been no aphid attack. Oh, we have plenty of plans. The question is, what can we do? One of the first things I think is to get this better estimate of regional risks. So we have funding for some SAGE trials which look at different regions. Unfortunately, it's only 3 regions. I would love to do more, where we do also a time of sowing, so different, probably April, May, beginning of June sowing. And in the same trial, we will also be looking at presence or absence of seed treatment to see if there is, in the end, an effect of the seed treatment.